The Runaway Robot by Lester Del Rey. Chapter 4. Runaway. When my power was turned on the next morning, nothing had changed. The thought was still there. I was going to run away. It didn't frighten me anymore. Now that it was an established idea, my thought process took over and used it as a base for planning. I decided to leave the next morning. I would start off in the direction of the spaceport on my first checking assignment and keep right on going. My specifications allowed me to run safely at a speed of about 18 miles an hour, and I can maintain that pace indefinitely. Running takes quite a little power, however, and even with a full charge, the 4-hour run to the spaceport would eat up power that would last throughout an ordinary day. But that would still leave me with ample power to return to Mr. Henning's farm after the Star Queen had blasted off. I was a little sad about what would happen after I got back. If Mr. Hennings thought I'd lost orientation and wandered away, it would make me unreliable, and he would probably put a governor on me. That's an electronic mechanism which overrides a robot's self-control and makes it impossible for him to go beyond a preset perimeter. A governor would make me a prisoner. I didn't care about that. After Paul left for Earth, Mr. Henning's farm would be as good a place as any for me to stay. Luckily, we were all recharged that night, and the next morning, when I started out, I was full of energy. I reached Mr. Henning's portside boundary and looked up. There was no one in sight, so I kept going. I set my pace at safe capacity and jogged off towards the spaceport. As I traveled, I saw several skimmers move here and there in various directions, but none came very close to me. It wouldn't have mattered anyhow, because they would think I was running an errand for my owner. Nor would anyone recognize me as the robot Mr. Simpson had sold to Mr. Hennings. I was different from the farm robots, but there were quite a few of my type and model on Ganymede. The only positive identification I had was my serial number. All robots have serial numbers cut into plates riveted into their torso boxes in front, but a serial number never means anything to anyone unless that particular robot has been stolen or has voluntarily gone out of bounds. I jogged comfortably along, the miles vanishing under my aluminum feet, and in about 4 hours the spaceport reared up on the horizon. A little farther on I could see the Star Queen standing proudly in her berth. She was so big she made everything around her look small by comparison. Even the control tower, the highest point at the spaceport, reached only halfway up her hull. As I came closer, I could see the people looking very small around the great ship. A big crowd had come from many miles to see the Star Queen. There was a great deal of bustle and activity. 2 freight ports were open, and a force of robots were loading the belongings of the families that were relocated back to Earth. There was a lot of furniture, a lot of crated objects. A thought occurred to me. It didn't seem that one 5-foot robot would have made much difference. But that was feeling sorry for myself. I killed the thought and moved quietly into the crowd. Nobody paid any attention to me. There were quite a few robots in the area, some waiting for their owners, others, given more personal freedom, were walking around enjoying the spectacle. I circled the ship, looking at it from all sides. Most of the activity was on the loading side, with the freight ports rearward and the passenger ramp up front. There was a big carpet at the foot of the passenger ramp, and a lot of people dressed in their very best, milling around, laughing and talking, the people who were going and the ones who were bidding them goodbye. I pushed through the crowd in the opposite direction, but then I froze, scared clear through. A skimmer stopped at the far forward end of the ship, and 2 men got out, Mr. Hennings and Mr. Bellows. They were both scowling, and it was easy to see they were there on business. They were looking for a runaway robot. I didn't stop to wonder what had gone wrong. That didn't matter. My mental energy was needed for more important things such as how to avoid being caught until I had seen Paul get aboard the Star Queen. That was what I had come for, and that was what I intended to do, get one last look at Paul. After that, I didn't care what happened to me. I looked around and saw 3 domestic robots of my type standing in a group. They were talking to each other and looking up at the ship. I moved in that direction and sidled up beside them. That way, if Mr. Bellow's darting eyes spotted me, identification would be almost impossible. But the 3 robots soon moved off in separate directions. I followed the one walking away from the ship, hoping my owner and his overseer would look in the other direction. Then I got another fright, a worse one. I had forgotten about my pants. I didn't have any pants on, and the other robots wore pants and aprons. Luckily, I was near a pile of empty crates, and I ducked behind it just as Mr. Bellow's eyes swung in my direction. I was pretty sure he hadn't seen me, but I couldn't be absolutely certain until I went to the far side of the pile and peered out. The 2 men had not moved from the place where I'd last seen them. They were standing beside the big carpet by the passenger ramp. Mr. Bellows was scanning the crowd, and they seemed to be waiting for someone. Something buzzed in my control box. I gripped the side of an empty crate in my steel hand, and it broke into splinters. The Simpson family had arrived at the passenger ramp and were getting out of a skimmer. They were all there, the four of them, but my whole attention was on Paul, and I could see he was not very happy, not like Jane, who was laughing and pulling at her mother's arm as she asked questions, nor like his father, who was being very adult but couldn't hide the pleasure that was growing in his face. Paul was not smiling. He looked broodingly at the big ship, as though he didn't care whether it was there or not. His eyes scanned the crowd restlessly. He took no interest in anything around him until Mr. Hennings saw the Simpsons and ran towards them, with Mr. Bellows following him. Mr. Hennings was very angry, and he waved his arms as he talked. I tried to follow his lips to see what he was saying, but I didn't have to. I knew what he was saying. And I knew what had gone wrong. I had been missing at the farm. They'd probably been watching me even more closely than usual, and when I couldn't be found, they'd assumed I'd run away and gone back to Paul. It had been the logical thing for them to think, and I'd been stupid not to realize it. But none of that mattered, really. I had achieved my purpose. I was safely hidden in a place where I could watch Paul and his family board the Star Queen. Mr. Hennings was angry, and I didn't have to hear his words to know that he was saying. He asked if I had gone back to the Simpsons, but Mr. Simpson shook his head, genuinely surprised at my having run away. Mr. Hennings said something more, and Mr. Simpson turned to Paul and asked a question. Paul shrugged and shook his head also. He didn't look unhappy about my escape, but not as obviously overjoyed as Jane. She made no effort to hide her happiness, until Mr. Hennings frowned at her, and her mother bent down and told her to be quiet. Mr. Hennings and Mr. Simpson had further conversation on the subject of my escape. I don't know whether Mr. Hennings asked for his money back or not. Probably not, because the sale was legal and delivery had been made. He was obviously disappointed at not finding me with the Simpsons, or at least hanging around in their vicinity. He conversed with Mr. Bellows for a few moments, and then both men moved back and stood watching the ship. The passengers were boarding now, and my escape was a closed subject as far as the Simpsons were concerned. After all, it wasn't their problem, and they had more important things to think about. They were going back to the green hills of Earth. Paul's whole manner had changed. He'd brightened and become more alert. His eyes were darting here and there, searching the crowd, and I was tempted to run out and wave to him, so that we could say a final goodbye before he boarded the ship. I might have done it, too, but he turned abruptly and hurried up the ramp and disappeared into the Star Queen. I watched the rest of the Simpson family follow him, waving to their friends until they too disappeared into the port. It was over. I felt let down. There was nothing holding me now, no reason not to walk out from behind my shelter and give myself up. I didn't dread it particularly. I knew Mr. Hennings would put a governor on me, approved Runaway. He would be foolish not to, because for a robot, second chances are unheard of. Anything a robot does once, he will usually do again, unless what he does is caused by a breakdown, and what I'd done hadn't been for that reason. I didn't dread the punishment I would receive, but I didn't rush out to give myself up. Mr. Hennings and Mr. Bellows had not moved. They stayed where they were, watching the passengers' ramp being dropped from the ship. It was pulled away, and the port was closed as the people down below gave a final cheer. The loading had been finished, and the cranes were starting to move away from the freight ports. I glanced in that direction, and something caught my eye. There was a rope hanging from the rear port, and as I watched, a figure appeared in the port. It moved swiftly and with decision, grasping the rope and leaping out toward the ground. It was a human, a boy, escaping from the ship. It was Paul. I stared, strange new emotions banging around in my control box as he came swiftly down the taut rope, reaching the ground, and ran toward the freight yard several hundred feet away. My controls questioned what my refractor tube claimed to have seen, but there was no doubt about it. The boy had been Paul. It may seem strange to you that his escape didn't cause a lot of excitement, but there was no reason why it should have. Nobody was paying any attention to the freight ports. The robots Paul encountered couldn't have cared less what he did. They were not conditioned to stop escaping boys. Nor did the foreman in charge of the loading take the escape seriously. They couldn't imagine a legitimate passenger on an earthbound ship wanting to get off. They probably thought Paul was a local youth who had sneaked onto the Star Queen for a thrill and was getting off the best way he could. At the time, Paul's escape was important only to me. I smashed a heavy box to splinters in my excitement. I wanted to run to him, but that would have been foolish. Everything was changed now. I had no intention of giving myself up. Henning's stupid farm was the last place in the universe I wanted to be. Paul had left the Star Queen, and I wanted to be with him. At that precise moment, Mr. Bellows and Mr. Hennings went into action. The crowd had been pushed back from the Star Queen, and she was moving as the powerful under-ramp hydraulics pushed her slowly towards the blasting pits. The ship had moved. That meant Paul was not going to be aboard when she blasted away. Even if the authorities discovered him, it was too late. The blast-off cycle had been started and would not be stopped for anyone or anything. The crowd still watched the ship, but Mr. Hennings and his overseer, after a few moments of conversation, began moving in my direction. They had decided to search the area. I looked around for cover. There were quite a few obstacles scattered around the port, things I could hide behind, but reaching them unobserved was the problem. I backed away, keeping the pile of boxes between me and the two men, and when they reached it, I had found a tool shed to hide behind. They searched the pile and then debated their next move. If they had split up, I would have been lost. But as it was, they stayed together, and when they moved to the left, I used the tool shed as cover and backed away again. Dodging them in this manner, I found some rocks on the far edge of the spaceport and found safety just as the Star Queen blasted off. Everyone, including myself, stopped to watch. It was a magnificent sight, a demonstration of applied power such as Ganymede seldom saw. Suddenly expanding gases hurling tons and tons of metal out into space, out past the gravity pull of Jupiter, high into the free fall of the void. And even more miraculous was the technology that had solved space and motion problems to a point where not a single passenger received any of the shock quotient involved. I had been given the mentality to marvel at this, but I had no time to dwell on it very long. I had to keep track of my two pursuers. They seemed to have lost their enthusiasm for the hunt by now, and I watched from behind a rock as they turned away from the ridges and went back to their skimmer. For the time being, they had given up. As soon as they were out of sight, I ran to the freight yard. I searched it from one end to the other, but I didn't find Paul. He hadn't taken any chances on a search. He had used the Star Queen's blast-off to make his own escape. But I thought I knew where to find him, in one of our hideouts. My only problem was to guess which one. I didn't have much to go on, it would only be a guess. But I chose the far one because we usually kept more supplies hidden there. I took a last look around the freight yard and headed in that direction.